Thank you for coming. I'm sure with the whole mix-up with the changing times, it was very difficult. But I'm glad that those of you who are with us are here. We certainly appreciate it. So our forum today is based on the Caribbean Desalination Association, CaribDA. I'd like to please introduce our panel forum. First, Ms. Victoria Vecini, who is a process engineer for Fluence, who is a company that's very active in the Caribbean area. Secondly, Professor Monica Buhan, who is a senior instructor at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. She's also a CaribDA Board of Director member. And last but certainly not least, a man who probably needs no introduction, Dr. Lino Gabrielli, who is a past president of IDA and also little known fact, was a board member of the CaribDA in fact, also. I'm just going to do a we're going to, I'll introduce CaribDA, myself and Dr. Gabrielli a little bit and talk about the CaribDA mission and what we do there. Then we'll talk about two other subjects, one on the outlook of what the Caribbean desalination and water reuse market looks like. And then we'll talk next something that's very important, not just in resiliency for folks that live in the greater Caribbean. It's not something like that I think most of the folks, the attendees here, see something as in the distance. It's something that's actually having a real effect, a very profound effect in the Caribbean right now. And both in terms of very dramatic change in weather patterns and also in how we deal with that and how this technology, how these two technologies, desalination and water reuse, are used and to build resiliency in that matter, which is the topic of the conference. So the Caribbean Desalination Association was formed in 2007 on the island of Curaçao, which used to be a part of the Netherlands Antilles. We have membership that represent the greater Caribbean, focused on the desal and water reuse sector, pretty similar mandate as the IDA has, where we share information, experiences, resources on desalination and water reuse technology in the Caribbean. Our goal is to transfer and exchange as much technology as possible. We also have a training mission. One of our most recent ones is that we prepare operators in the sector with a membrane operator training certification in conjunction with one of our local partners, COASA. And something that's come out of this whole resiliency effort that we've spoken about, which specifically is that we've become a key component in the aid, in the humanitarian disaster piece in the Caribbean. As we'll go into a little bit, and you'll see from the effect of particularly the hurricanes, but also droughts, in the sector, governments come to us and say, hey, listen, this is what happened. We've just had a hurricane. We have no water. Or we've just had an earthquake. It's happened once, and our dam is broken. We've only had one. We have no water. And we've been sort of pulled into that mission, and it's become part of what we do as CaribDA, a pretty important part. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And in that particular, we coordinate and cooperate with a lot of NGOs, a lot of local and international NGOs, and we'll just kind of touch on that briefly. And last but not least, of course, we are a regional affiliate for the IDA. So, Caribbean, everyone's got a perception. Most of the time when folks come to visit the Caribbean, it's to relax. And there's a perception that the Caribbean is a place that is very relaxed and the people are, and that's sort of true to some degree, but we also do a fair amount of work there. But we're going to keep this forum Caribbean style, very relaxed. After we do our brief presentations, our exchanges, we'd like to involve you as much as ourselves, so you're not just here listening. We'd like to make this a real, I'm sure I'll get this name wrong, something that we're all involved in. Not going to go into this into a lot of detail, but just to give you an idea of why it's sort of challenging to have an organization in the Caribbean. We are made up of, I think at this point, something over 30 different island nation countries or and so forth. A large part of Caribbean is dependent upon desalination, it has been for a while. We're 7,000 different archipelagical islands, over 1 million square mile area. Most of the Caribbean doesn't have any storage or very little storage capacity. And in fact, the thing that the Caribbean economy is based on, the majority, not all, more than anything else, mass tourism has created one of the huge needs for having additional water. Most of the islands were pretty self-sustaining until we started bringing in cruise ships of thousands of people at a time onto places that are not set up to support that type of infrastructure. And interestingly enough, because we'll talk about this in a little bit in detail, we've had, because of because of these factors and others, the Caribbean has had desalination for almost 90 years. We've got 2 member organizations, one that just celebrated its 90th anniversary and one its 85th. And because energy is so expensive in the Caribbean, in some places 40 cents per kilowatt hour, 30 is not unheard of. Energy is so dear and we have so much desalination that a lot of the innovations that have been done with energy recovery were actually, some were created in the Caribbean and a lot of others were tested there. So this is kind of in the Caribbean. The Key West stretches 99 miles into the Caribbean. At some point it's only about 60 miles away from Cuba. And this was one of the first desalination, and this is a slide I have to, from Dr. Jim Burkett and his archives. One of the first desalination plants in 1861, it was for military use, very small distillation unit. This is kind of a timeline. I'm not going to go through this and bore you to death, but as you can see, you know, as I've kind of pointed out, there's over 100 years of desalination use in the Caribbean. So although it's not a big place, you know, we're very experienced in the use of desalination technology. And in fact, right now, there's been a lot of discussion here on PPP. Some of the earliest build, own, and operate contracts in the world were done in the Caribbean. And starting out on small hotels and then with some of the governments. So that sort of contract development, a lot of it took place. In fact, I would say even for the population of the Caribbean, there are probably the majority of the governments there that have desalination and water reuse contracts. It's under some form of PPP. As I said, as I pointed out, 2 of our member organizations, Web Aruba, just celebrated its 86th anniversary, and their counterpart on Curaçao, Aqualectra, its 81st. Aruba's first ME plant was in operation in 1932, and that's a sort of picture of the distillation units. So it's a pretty long history. This is kind of an anomaly for the Caribbean. Most of the plants tend to be on the smaller size, and for that, it probably doesn't get a lot of press. It's not the 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 cubic meters per day plants, with the one exception of this plant in Trinidad, which is Point Lisa's, which was built at 24 million gallons per day, which at the time was the largest plant in the Western Hemisphere. It's since been expanded to about 41 million gallons per day, which is 155,000 meters cubed per day, on very difficult to treat water. So this is probably our largest single plant reference in the Caribbean. So with energy being so expensive in the Caribbean, you know, there's a lot of push lately to incorporate renewable energy to help, as I said, I think our average energy price, and it varies pretty widely, but is somewhere around 20, 25 cents, and as high as 45 cents in some places. So incorporating renewable energy into the plants has been pretty key. This is a pretty small plant. I mean, it's a very small plant, but fully powered by Seawater RO. It only operates a few hours per day. Bonaire, which is a place near and dear to my heart, I live there about 3 months out of the year. And a lot of my family's from there, is almost entirely renewable energy powered. Has a huge windmill field for the size of the island. It's pretty large, 11 megawatts. I'm sure in most places that wouldn't make much of a dent, but for us it's pretty significant. And with the 2.5 megawatt battery system, and it's just started introducing and putting in a solar field. we're going to talk a little bit about water reuse projects and why they can't work, which I've heard a lot, and and even in the Caribbean, and it's not widely implemented, but there are water reuse projects, and this is one that just, again, as I said, to me, Bonaire is home part of the year, so it's about 1 million gallon per day wastewater treatment system, which is actually at the center of town where most of the tourism is. There's not a lot of tourism in Bonaire. It's a place that people go particularly to scuba dive. There's not much else there except for scuba diving, which is pretty excellent. But at any rate, all of the water is treated and it's sold back with an additional line for distribution for water reuse, and it's paid for and it's supported by the resorts and the hotels that are taking the water, primarily using it at this point for agricultural use. Well, for watering their their lawns and their orange. It's a desert island, so without watering, you don't grow much except cactus. We're going to talk a little bit, I think, Victoria Vicini is going to talk to us a little bit about some of these decentralized plants, which we'll talk to about in a little bit, and large wastewater treatment plants, except maybe a few in some of the larger islands, such as Trinidad, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, don't really exist because the population centers are dispersed. There aren't really dense population centers. So to try to put collection pipelines to all of the different homes or businesses, and it's almost impossible. So a lot of the larger resorts and hotels have their own, but most of the homes are using septic tanks, which is becoming sort of problematic because in the Caribbean, the majority of the islands are very low-lying, maybe just a few feet above sea level. And what's happened is we're experiencing sea level raise. In fact, in my own home, my wells that I use to irrigate my lawn and my trees they've salted up in the last couple years. The water in my wells kills my grass now, so I don't have grass anymore. And apart from that, with the septic tanks, they need a certain level of dry ground beneath them to function properly. And right now, where we had 6 feet, I think, is about the minimum need of dry ground beneath it to function properly. We've gone below that in a lot of places. In fact, in South Florida, I think they're going to have to replace over the next few years something like 7 or 8 million septic tank systems that are presently not functioning properly. And because it's a coral limestone based that's what the ground is, that just leaches and goes directly to the ocean. And as you know, we are a tourism-based economy, so having unfunctioning septic tank leakage going to the ocean is not good, or it's horrible for the coral reefs, which is, again, just not going in. But another small island in the Caribbean, St. Eustatius, has 100% solar power in the day. In the daytime, it operates fully 100% on power. It's also completely dependent upon desalination. We do have some places in the Caribbean that have geothermal energy. I won't go into a lot of detail. And just kind of talking about resiliency just really quickly, and I think I'll go back at the end of this after we get to the panel, and where this comes into play, and sort of the earthquake is a little bit. We've had a number of pretty devastating hurricanes over the last 3 years. Matthew in 2016 really devastated Haiti and a few other islands in the Caribbean. Some of the largest storms that they've had, as I've said, we've got pulled into these humanitarian efforts where we bring systems to treat water that's contaminated with cholera. In 2017, we had 3 hurricanes in a row that came through, 2 of which were pretty catastrophic, and right in back of these was another one called Maria, which completely wiped out the populations of some of the smaller islands in the Caribbean. I mean, their homes and the resort, not so much. There were a lot of deaths as well, but it destroyed their water supply systems. So part of it, as I said, our mission, we came in and we brought our membership. We had a call to our memberships and we had volunteers, and they volunteer equipment, and we went to a few different places in Barbuda, and Dominica, which are two Caribbean islands, and we installed emergency desalination equipment at the hospital and one of the city centers, and then again, one plant for the whole island. As you can see, a small UF unit that was installed there. So it's sort of become part of our mission as an entity, as a sort of an NGO working with others. This was a plant that was destroyed in Bermuda that we replaced. So I'm gonna probably end it there and not go into any of this into a lot of detail, but I sort of will, we just had a Hurricane Dorian, which went through the Bahamas, and this year, and they're still trying to recover from some of the northern islands in the Bahamas. And we are currently in the process we have on our webpage, if anyone would want to visit, we're collecting donations, which we're taking in, and we're bringing equipment and our people and going into place to help the island come back to place by making sure they have water to drink. So that's the down note. The good note, and this is in the Bahamas as well. And next year, May 2020, Nassau, CaribDA is having their next conference. So I'll just leave this up for a bit. And I'm going to pass things over to Professor Monica Boodham so we can start our forum and hopefully engage everyone in the audience in as well. Sorry, I jumped the order. Dr. Gabriele is going to give us a few moments of a presentation, brief, to give some more background on island operations.
Actually, this was the last slide of my previous presentation. I have not made a mistake, because there is a link. You may have heard Sean saying that, in fact, I was a director of CaribDA for a while. And I don't know if all of you are aware that according to the constitution of the IDA, the region that CaribDA belongs and Latin America belong in one. In fact, it's LATAC. And as there were not many members from this region, only one director was allocated to this region. It was only allocated only because there was, in fact, the Caribbean already. In fact, when this morning I said that there were only 4 members of Latin America when I wanted to go back to the board, luckily CaribDA had more than 50 cross members with the IDA, so that they were in fact a regional affiliate with the right of having a person on the board. So when I wanted to go in and I was elected with a Latin American focus, somehow I stole one director from CaribDA, but luckily they had their own director, which was the representative of CaribDA, and they were kind enough to accept my well-meaning action, not to take away the spotlight from them, and in fact they've been very good partners of Latin America in doing this. In fact, they've had also sessions together, CaribDA with Aladir, and so it has been a successful story, I think, and the governor was kind enough to immediately invite me to run to become a member of the board of CaribDA, and so I had the pleasure for 4 years to be a director also of CaribDA. So that is why I spent 2-3 minutes, but at least you realize why in the IDA, structurally, there is a very, very strong link between Latin America and CaribDA, because the director elected in this region represents the two. Now, it's a coincidence that there was this one. I wanted to link the two, but the Agua Dulce you have heard about, I mean, it's a different type of islands. I mean, it's remote communities. I mean, the 1,000 communities where this is are very close to what islands are, and that is really something which is relevant. Go back. Okay, and so, well, most of you would realize that I am towards the end of my career, and when in fact I finished working with Ray and I was freer to do things, there were 2 pet projects that I like to follow. One was the Agua Dulce, of which I was able to become consultant, but also an organization which is very much close to CaribDA, which is this Greening the Islands. Greening the Islands is in fact, an organization that tries to bring together the islands which are trying to strive to become green. Green meaning that you have as much as possible the renewable energy, electric mobility, and all those things that make an island sustainable. And so this is what the mission is. And the idea is, as you've heard, in the Caribbean, there are quite a few islands that now are all relying already on solar energy and desalination with renewable energy. And so these organizations, Greening the Islands, have created, in fact, what they call the observatory, which is islands that are already on the path of becoming green, can get together and share experiences and create, in fact, the momentum for islands to become such. And there is no doubt, I mean, the sad moment of history we live as humankind is this climate change scenario. And it's very sad that the brothers of ours that no matter what are going to suffer more and more and first from this is the islands. So the focus of the world, of the well-meaning political efforts even of the world have to be on the islands, because they've got the right to be thought of by those ones that don't have their own problems. So recently we were in fact in an island in Sicily, but what last year happened in the islands went to the CaribDA, no, 2 years ago, sorry, went to the CaribDA conference, and in that occasion the head of the Green the Islands met in fact the Minister of Curaçao, and in fact they talked that Curaçao may be one of the ones that could join the observatory of Greening the Islands. And the Germans have got, 4 months ago, I was there as well. So I hope that in due course, my brothers of the Caribbean come more and more strongly into this community, because probably these islands of the Caribbean are among the most advanced towards renewable situation. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilio. So I'll just move to the panel now. Would you all like to comment on the state of the desalination market in the Greater Caribbean region? Maybe we could start with Victoria. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Monica. First of all, I'd like to say that I am a process engineer, so my knowledge of the Caribbean market is not directly, because I'm not, I don't go and visit the islands or the Caribbean, but I am in the technical support for the sellers that they do visit. So the knowledge that I have, it's very technical, I guess, and it's a little from the distance, but let me try to start by saying what are my views in the projects that we have seen in the Caribbean. I think they're we can see two different scenarios in a lot of things, like there are two types of islands or territories. There's the rich island that has a lot of support, like Antigua or the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, and this you can see bigger projects with a lot of or that can withstand more investment, and then you have more poor islands that you can see equipment that are simpler with not a lot of investment, and obviously decentralized because it's not huge plants that you can see there. And of course, there's two types of markets: the municipal market. That is, I guess there are a few islands. You probably know better than me, but a few islands with desalination for municipal water. But desalination is mostly for, or the projects that I've seen are mostly in the touristic industry for hotels and resorts, with a cost of energy, as you mentioned, Sean, of $0.45 per kilowatt an hour. It's obviously very expensive to produce water. We can see values of up to $8 per cubic meter of water, which is obviously very high, and there is a lot of room for improvement in the technology, in the energy recovery, and in the OpEx of the plants, of course, and that's obviously related to the technology. That's where we're here. I guess a lot of things that are being discussed during the panels are how to improve the cost of operation of the desalination plants and all kinds of plants. And a few things that I've seen that are constraints when you're designing a system or working on these projects is the coral reef protections. There are a lot of concerns about the disposal of the brine and how it will affect. We know that there are lots of studies in this matter, and there are proof of what can be done right, so you don't interfere with the ecosystem, but still there are lots of concern, and I think that's CaribDA has a very important role in this thing, in educating people and in training the operators, like you mentioned. There is a lot of room for improvement in that area, I think, and, well, of course, in energy recovery systems.
Okay, well, as a few years that I've lost the contact with the Caribbean, I can offer some observations which I have from there. So if they're right, okay. But if they're wrong, at least it's a good excuse for you to put the record straight. When I've been participating at your activities, I remember envying you from a general desalination person of the fact that in the Caribbean, due to their geology, the reef, you can have successful beach wells where you've got water that comes to the RO plant very nicely filtered already. So that is one luck that our friends in the Caribbean have. Having said so, I do not remember having heard much about reuse. Now, obviously, there are the islands which are scattered people with septic tanks, but there are also areas where you've got your collection. And in a situation like the islands of the Caribbean that need desalination, I would imagine that the stress of reuse and the potential reuse should obviously be there. I remember in those days when we've had 2 or 3 conferences there in big resorts, it was the time when I discovered what they were doing in these shopping centers in Brazil. So I'd be curious to know, in fact, instead of presentation, I'm asking the panel, in the Caribbean, in these big resorts, are there those who actually treat on the site their sewage, maybe MBR, and then they use this water for their golf course or for their toilets?
Thank you. So to continue on Emilio's point, so as I mentioned earlier, the desalination market is very mature in the Caribbean. It's been around for almost 100 years, and the growth is probably pretty slow, 5%, population-wise. So there's not any explosive growth in the desal market. We are not likely to see another 150,000 meters cube plant again, like Trinidad, Point Lisa's anytime soon, which is also Monica's home.
Yes.
So, to your point, the reuse market potential is pretty huge. It still has the same stigma, but the driver is much bigger than in most places. Can you imagine being dependent upon almost 100% on desal, as most of the Caribbean is, using energy that's 40 cents per kilowatt hour, and then letting that water go back to the ocean without recapturing it, which is, in general, when you look at a municipal level from government, with few exceptions, that's what's happening. With the exception, as I showed in the slide presentation of Bonaire, who is taking part of theirs. And it's very challenging, as I said, to do it in a large way on a municipal basis because there are not large centers. People on most of the islands, except again the very large ones like Puerto Rico and Jamaica and Cuba, the populations are very spread out. So it's impossible on a financial basis to be able to connect everyone up to have them on a municipal basis in general. That being said, there have been a lot of inroads with decentralized wastewater treatment plants, which Victoria's company has been doing very well, Fluence, putting these decentralized plants in small, very efficient wastewater treatment plants that produce water that's literally almost drinking water quality. That's an innovation that's coming about. I think that's going to be used a lot more. As I mentioned, we're already experiencing sea level rise. And you can, maybe in most larger continental states can look and say, well, that's in 2030, 50, that's when we'll have to worry about it. But people are experiencing this in most of the Caribbean now. So as I said earlier, a lot of the septic tanks aren't working. And so there's going to be a big driver to push forward, not only from a perspective of sanitation and health, but it's economically, to me, it makes the case for itself. So, but it is used a lot. Most of the hotels who are buying, the larger hotels and resorts, do have wastewater treatment plants that they take the water and they reuse it for irrigation. And there are some really progressive resorts and hotels that even have 2 sets of lines built in when they start the resort. One set for that they reuse the gray water that goes back to the sanitary facilities, and it's almost like a continual loop. And then there are other lines where they have this water coming in for potable purposes and hygiene and so forth. So part of that is there, and it's done on probably more on a private basis than on a municipal basis, as I said, because of the challenges. But it's starting, and that potential is huge. And I think the drivers, both from the potential, both from the aspect of changes in the environment that we're seeing right now and the climate changes as one driver, and that financial driver just gets larger all the time, you know, even though with the advances in energy recovery and desal.
Thank you, Sean. To follow up on that, can you comment on some of the opportunities that exist in the Greater Caribbean region?
I guess the biggest market would be, as you said, reuse and probably decentralized solutions. The piping system, or if there is, when there is piping, it's probably a little obsolete, so there are lots of losses. Losses account up to 40%, as I have read. So there's a lot of waste of water, so the decentralized solution is always a good way to solve the issue in situ and have a waste that you're going to dispose and have actually an environmental issue with disposing, and with nutrient removal you can get water that obviously it's not going to be used in the future, in the short future time for potable uses because of the public acceptance, and it probably needs advanced treatment for it to be reused as potable water, but as another points of consumption. I'm sure that's probably the way that the market is going. And another thing that we have mentioned, I guess, is the use of cleaner energy to produce that. I mean, we've seen in this conference a lot of examples of treatment solutions that are very compact and have ways of operating with cleaner energy. So I'm guessing this is probably a good in the short future.
Thank you. At this stage, I'd like to open up to the audience for a question or two before we proceed to the next segment.
As the last, you are mentioning about climate change. You are surrounded by the biggest pollutant in the world, which is the United States, right? At present, are you get affected by hurricanes, which is taking place in East United States? And because in America they have system to monitor the hurricanes, directions and heights and all that. In you, do you look at it as a big challenge or a threat for you now and in the future when the climate change become worse? Thank you.
Well, I'm part of a group that's called the High Level Forum of Caribbean Ministers, which is it's made up of 20 different countries in the Caribbean responsible for water. And one of the head of them has a saying, and he says, the small island states do the least to contribute to what is perceived as global warming, but we suffer the worst from it because of just the way that it's made up. So it's, no one can say exactly conclusively what is causing what. I mean, it's clear we have climate change, without a doubt. As I said, our sea levels are rising. The number and intensity of hurricanes that we get in our region has just gone, it's increased to a level that since they've been recording these storms, they have not had storms of this intensity. People in Anguilla recorded sustained winds of over 250 miles per hour during Irma, which it's never been recorded since they've been able to take those sort of records. So that's unavoidable. I mean, but what's being done in the Caribbean is that they're looking to put together a number of practical steps. And as I said, that high-level forum of Caribbean ministers for about 20 different islands, and in fact, they've passed resolution and are starting to put in place, as they can afford to do, ways to mitigate some of these changes that are going on now. And it's pretty intensive, and it's a pretty long-step program, and some are farther along than others, but people are absolutely taking concrete steps to help the survivability of the islands. And when I say survivability, as I pointed out in some of those storms from 2017, literally the entire population of Barbuda had to be evacuated. The entire population of Dominica was evacuated, and just now the northern Bahamian islands that were hit by Dorian this year were evacuated. And so it's creating change. And if I could point back, and so it's not all doom and gloom, when we look at what do you do about this after the fact, and to the last question that was put out, you know, what opportunity, and it's sort of almost you feel bad to talk about opportunity in the face of things like this, because, but in fact, some of the different Caribbean nations that had surge waves, that did have water storage capacity, were completely salted over. Some were under 20 feet of surge waves, and it completely salted in what little potable water storage that they had. So the only way that this is going to be, that they'll have water, is that they'll have to install additional desalination. And as Victoria pointed out, the potential on the wastewater reuse side is pretty significant.
Actually, I have a question myself, if I'm allowed.
Of course,
I talked
yes.
about, in fact, the resorts, big resorts, going them alone to do reuse by treating the waste there, or maybe they may even decide to do their own desalination plant. Now, on the whole, how do the countries facilitate or non-facilitate this? In many places, the utilities, local utilities, make it hard for people to try to do themselves, or you have to pay a big penalty to do it yourself. So a resort is totally free to reside. Okay, forget about the utility, and they do my water, or?
Well, there's you know, when you talk about the Caribbean, there's no such thing as one Caribbean. As I said, there's many countries and there's different rules. You go to a place like Cayman, which has a very advanced, I think, 100% connectivity on distributed water. They do not allow you to produce your own water for drinking water purposes. Where others are subsidizing the water cost pretty significantly, they encourage you to produce your own drinking water and to treat your own wastewater. So you find all of the different scenarios depending on the municipality. It ranges the whole spectrum.
And to follow up with what Sean was saying, interestingly, in Trinidad and Tobago, our water authority owns every drop of water in the islands. You are not allowed, the farmers, for example, during droughts, they are not allowed to go to the rivers to take water to water their plants. There are a lot of water restrictions, so you are not allowed to collect water. It's illegal to collect water. If you are caught watering your plants, for example, you could get fined. If you are caught using water that belongs to WASA, which is the governing authority, without their permission, you are fined. And there have been situations in the past where during droughts, farmers were caught, in inverted commas, stealing water. to look after their plants. So as Sean said, as you go from country to country, it changes. It definitely changes, yes? So maybe I could follow up again. We could look at our challenges in the Caribbean. Just talking about, so worldwide, we have a lot of droughts because of climate change. So we've seen a lot of changing weather patterns, a lot of droughts, etc. How has that affected the water levels, the water accessibility in the Caribbean region?
Well, I guess the water drafts, it translates directly to higher salinity in the well waters where there is, and there is less availability, so and a lot of increments in cost, in operational cost, and plants that cannot produce as much water as they were supposed to. So I guess that's probably the biggest impact as I can.
Yeah. And are any steps being taken to build resiliency in this area?
What's that?
To build resiliency in terms of the water supply as we fight against the challenges produced by climate change?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of things that I don't know who is responsible for building resiliency. I think there are lots of ways that you can see the issue. I guess the governments have a lot of responsibility there. I'm sure there are some governments that are doing things to improve, to have there are projects there to improve resiliency, to reduce to choose energies that are cleaner or to reduce carbon footprint. But I also think that the population is, I'm not saying let's do a revolution and let's bring all the young people to the street claiming for water, which is happening around the world, I guess. But I do think that there is, everybody has a part in this, and we as technology experts, our role is obviously to make the technology as the best that we can. We know that we're practically at the limit of the energy recovery devices capacities, and there's always little innovations that turn into a little best quality or less operational cost or less capex. So I guess everybody has a role in this situation. And education, I guess the consumers, I don't know exactly what is the population I don't know the word for that in English, sorry. What is their position on water, if there's enough consciousness of the consumption and the waste. So, but I think everybody has a role in this matter.
Yes.
Well, in creating resilience, I wonder if eventually there'll be some places which go to desalination located on a boat. For a long time, it has been talked of. In fact, I remember at a certain stage, it seemed that Petrobras in Brazil would build a big desalination plant on a boat and service its islands, which are the platforms, with this boat going around. Unfortunately, if you put it on a boat, it's very difficult to use renewable energy because whether it would be dirty desalination. But talking of resiliency, I presume it's easier to protect a boat than to protect a desalination plant on low-lying areas or whatever. So that is just a thought I had while you were talking.
So there are steps that in general, and I say in general because as we discussed, there's no cohesive, although this one group of Caribbean ministers of 15, there are still another 40 island nations that are doing something completely different. But in general, the movement towards renewable energy is huge, and that's for sure. Desalination plants more additional ones are being built, and governments that never had a desalination plant in their life are putting them in because they know that after an emergency, once the donated bottles of water are gone, and that's horribly unsustainable, those millions and millions of plastic bottles that come in after a disaster. So they're putting in desalination plants in places there have never been before. So that's part of it. And as it turns out, Desalination plants are pretty durable. The majority of them were up and running within 7 days after those 3 major storms, with 1 or 2 exceptions. They know, they have experience in preparing, and so they disconnect the intakes, they make sure they de-wire and depower all the electrics. So if the water comes up, once it recedes, they just dry it out and they can restart again. So they're pretty experienced with that, and they do a pretty good job. And that's part of it. The other part, they're looking for additional storage. Unfortunately, even with you talk about something as part of resiliency like renewable energy, one thing that didn't survive very well the storms were the solar panels. There were whole fields of 5 megawatts that there was almost nothing left. There was one place, Anguilla, that had just the month before the storm had almost completed the installation of a 1 megawatt field, and the entire thing was blown away before they even generated 1 kilowatt. So I'm not sure how sustainable that is, but it's part of the strategy.
And to follow up a bit on resilience, in the past maybe 3-4 years, we've seen the Caribbean being hit by a lot of really, really bad hurricanes. And in cases like Haiti and across the islands, there has been a very reactive expression from the Caribbean community in general. But are there any specific projects being undertaken that are helping to prepare, like build plans or put in some steps that would help in resilience, like preparation, like proactive steps, as opposed to reactive?
Can I make a comment while you
Yes.
think of the answer? Mine is not an answer to what Monica was saying, but just sharing with people here. Since I knew CaribDA, but then later with this latest connection with greening the islands, we know that there are a lot of, unjust things in the world. But it's amazing how unfair it is of the islands, as you are saying, that contribute so little to global warming.
Yes.
And our brothers on the islands have to be the ones that have such problems. I mean, you said it with just a few words. Okay, well, those 3 islands had to be evacuated. But what does it mean? Think of your old grandfather, grandmother, the sick people and whatever. So thinking that, happily in the big countries, we keep on producing CO2 and the like, and the people of the islands, I live in Australia, and some of the Pacific islands, as you know, New Zealand have already allocated, because it's a big, Australia is too big, so it's considered an arrogant neighbor to the islands of the Pacific. But New Zealand is smaller and is the preferred partner. Part of New Zealand has already been allocated to receive the total population of those countries that will not exist again in 10, 20 years. Now, think how fair that is. Sorry, you didn't have an answer, but I was so keen to say this that I said it. But it really makes you feel uncomfortable that there are such unjust situations. Okay.
Yes, I agree, Emilio. It's being so tiny islands, and every year these islands need to prepare. When a hurricane is coming, there's a good chance now that the hurricane is going to do such terrible destruction. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people lose their homes, and more so, they have no access to drinking water. The CaribDA's Humanitarian Committee steps in, and we've done a lot of different projects, but as I said, that's more reactive. But I think, things need to be done more proactive. How do we build resilience in the Caribbean? How do we ensure that our water supply remains safe in times of natural disasters? Sean, do you know of any particular projects?
Well, the one that I'm most familiar with is the one, and it's collective because it's a number of different governments working together. And they just released the Declaration of Baccalaureate. I don't know. I don't remember the name of it. It's one of the cities. That was signed by, I think, as I said, about 15 different governments. And it takes concrete steps. As I said, increasing storage, safe storage, so that there is additional storage. Unfortunately, when a storm is coming, most people know, and so they want to have water.
Yes.
And one of the things that happens is they draw down the reservoirs and the tanks, and when they're empty, they don't survive storms very well. And so they're producing as much as they can, in the time when the storm is coming. And by the time the storm comes, if it hits an empty glass line tank, even the concrete tanks, some of them were destroyed in this last storm. So that's one aspect that they're working on, increasing some resilient storage capacity. As I said, there's been a really massive effort throughout the Caribbean to go as close to 100% green energy as possible. Some are already there 100%, which is pretty amazing. And a number of other steps, educating folks, figuring out in some places where they already have seawater intrusion, they have plans, they haven't acted on them because the issue of public acceptance of re-injecting reused or treated wastewater into the ground to act as a buffer, there's not a lot of storage capacity, but there is some. So they've sort of gone down that path in some places. So that's some of the efforts. But there's a whole proclamation of concrete steps that they're taking, and I'll be happy to share it if anyone's interested.
Thank
Just
you.
one last comment.
Yes.
Sorry, Monica. There is another committee. I wrote down the name because I know I wasn't going to remember. It's called the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. So it's 5 Cs. And it's the resilience project, and it's the same as you said. I don't know exactly the details of the project for improving resilience, but there's also for reducing water loss and to going into more cleaner energies, and of course training and education. That's what we've been saying. So yeah. So I invite you to find out more about this project. If you're interested.
Thank you. And before we open up again for questions, just one more question. What role does desalination play in disaster relief?
Well, I guess we've been sort of talking about that.
Yes.
I guess it's obviously very important. I think this is also something that we have heard during this conference. Desalination is obviously very important, but there's also the reuse. If you pay $8 per cubic meter to produce water, and then you pay $6 to treat the wastewater, and you're not reusing, you're wasting a lot of money. So I think desalination has always been an option, and it still is, and it's probably robust, and they know how to use it. But I also think that reuse is a very good opportunity. I think more than 85% of the wastewater treatment systems in the Caribbean are not operating at full capacity, or they have some issues and they're not complying with the discharge. So there's a big opportunity there. And again, I don't like saying the word opportunity, but it's an opportunity for reuse. And I mean, there are two aspects of that: improving the discharge to the environment, and also reusing the water.
Well, it is very... finished?
Yeah.
No, it's very good news to hear from Sean that already there is mounting evidence that the desalination plants are resilient under hurricane conditions, and on the whole they can be put back to service 1 week later, because as you are saying, with this non-sustainable way we have created our society, having millions of bottled water that obviously that you have to give people, but then you have to do something with these bottles, and if you can do it safely with your on-site desalination plant, that is much, much better. So I didn't know that there was this experience, but it's good to know.
So, of course, in short term, long term, the desalination, as I've said, has been used time and time again after an emergency. And, unfortunately for most Caribbean islands, they might have 1 or 2 sources of energy generation, typically after a storm. They're out, and that's sort of the determinant factor when they can get most of the municipal plants back online, when they have the energy back online. Yeah, and it's part of it, and as they get worse, as I said, almost every island nation that I'm aware of, that even those who've never needed desal in their existence, is looking at having at least some capacity installed as a part of their resiliency effort. So.
Thank you. Now I'd like to open up to the audience in case you have any questions. Yes? A mic, please.
Hello? Okay. the prices that we normally read about, the boot projects in the Caribbean islands are extremely high. And I do understand that a lot of that price is due to energy consumption. And maybe the energy price will be $1.5 to $2. But we listen prices of more than $5. What is the reason for those high prices over there?
Well, smaller plants are by nature, you get efficiencies on larger plant. A plant that's, for example, if you build under let's say a build own operate basis, a plant that's 1 million gallons per day compared to a plant that's 10 million gallons per day, you can use almost the same amount of labor. So the distributed cost for producing each meter cube gets higher. And when you look at, as I said, most of the plants in the Caribbean are even smaller than that, it gets much more expensive. So you get a lot of efficiencies that make large plants, mega plants, as people say, plants larger than 100,000 meters cubed per day, are much more cost effective because of efficiencies. And also, as you pointed out, energy is the biggest factor, with 40% of the cost of a delivered produced water from desal coming from the energy side. If you're paying 5 cents compared to 40 cents, it makes a big difference in the final produced water cost.
I have another question if I can. Okay, since you have a very large experience with desalination, and there are islands that are completely supplied by desalinated water, what is your experience with corrosion?
I'm sorry, I'll go with what?
Corrosion in the system, in the distribution system, for those islands that are supplied only with desalinated water.
Well, generally when desal first comes into play, corrosion is horrible, particularly plants that, islands who had older distribution systems. I mean, you have a sediment that suddenly is getting dissolved, and then in some cases you have no pipes left. I mean, there are some settlements that are a couple hundred years old that they've dug up and they still have wooden pipes, literally. So, I mean, and in those cases it's pretty terrible. But, you know, to be perfectly honest, I think the average non-revenue water in the Caribbean is above 50%. So the bigger issue is not so much what it's doing to the pipes, but it's just doesn't get where it's supposed to go, unfortunately, in a lot of cases.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
I'm Tsuzuki from Japan, and I'm very interested in the water quality monitoring for the water reuse plant. And at the end of the day, when the people use the recycled water directly to the potable water, we need the very high level water quality monitoring. And if the plant is large and centralized, that cost can be a very small portion of the whole cost. But for the distributed small plant, the cost for the water quality monitoring can become a serious issue. So how do you think to cope with that issue?
I'm not sure I understood your question, but I guess that if you are the reuse that we're talking about is not really for direct potable reuse.
Presently.
Okay,
But
yes.
in future.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In the future, I'm not sure that decentralized would be the best solution for this for direct potable reuse. It needs, as you mentioned, it needs a lot of stages of treatment, advanced oxidation, and a lot of monitoring. So I'm not sure that it's going to go into that direction, into the decentralized configuration. It's probably going, I guess, it's just a educated guess, I guess, but I'm not sure that it's going to go into the decentralized direction. It might go into the centralized plants.
And even the decentralized small plant, if the water will be used for the potable water, the water quality, the safety must be monitored
Yeah.
very seriously. And for the big water plant, the cost for the water quality monitoring is not so big portion. But for the small
Yeah.
plant, the cost for the monitoring, water quality monitoring, can become very big portion for the total cost. So my question is how we can cope with that cost issue for the water quality monitoring.
Well, I guess.
Well, if I'm allowed, that is one of the challenges you have when you go down with scale, because it's very easy to talk, in fact, of economy of scale and lower cost, but you cannot cut corners when you are, in fact, talking of the health of people. So I'm afraid that when you go down to the lower scale, the costs will go up dramatically, and you don't want to cut them any further because you have to be safe for what you give people. So I don't think there is any magic answer to this.
No, I guess it will probably depend of the cost of the distribution of the water, or making new networks and distributing the water, which is so you can have a centralized plant and have monitoring there. I guess it will come up to that economical balance of having decentralized plants versus a big plant with distribution, I guess. I'm not sure if I...
Well, I have a little bit of a different perspective on that. And of course, everything that you say is true, but also when you have a number of small plants, and this is from one of my past life experience. I don't mean past life in a spooky way. I mean a past job way. We operated a number of very small plants, and if they're all in the same area, your labor costs are not so horrible. And that, the worst part of that is the labor. So if you've got one group of people that's responsible, the same one who would maybe do one, if they're somewhat centrally located, like on one island, and they can take care of 20 plants, as you would do one large one, then you can make it work. You can get the economics to work.
Absolutely. I guess energy efficiency is not going to be the same, so that's, and with the cost of energy, it will, so I guess there are lots of things that turn the decision into one place, so I don't think we have the answer, a specific answer. So.
Thank you. And my last comment is that we, Japan, is also the island, and we also suffered from the very severe typhoon every year. So I believe, I'm representing the Japanese JDA, so, and I believe that JDA and CaribDA can do together something together to cope with the problems we are facing.
Well, if you allow me to put my IDA hat on, well, it's very nice to hear the Japanese Desalination Association. I'll be very happy to work with CaribDA.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm so sorry, but we'll have to end. I think we went a little over the time already, so I'll just pass over to Sean to close up quickly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Monica, and thanks to our panel, I think, and thank you all for attending, and I hope we were able to inform you about what, how things are going in our part of the world. So, thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
Better get out of here.
Yeah.
Over the time.